It was March of 1987. How many of us can remember 1987?
Oh gosh.
Yeah. The three youngest folk in the room, I noticed didn't raise their hands. So I was one. We all were once where you are too. Anyway, the Friends Center at Guilford College had, and still has, a program where they invite one or more distinguished Quaker visitors to the campus in order to celebrate and educate the students about the Quaker heritage. This particular year, they had invited 3 women who held or had recently held positions of leadership, and prominent positions of leadership at that, in Quaker organizations. Asia Bennett was Executive Secretary of the American Friends Service Committee. Kara Cole had just left her job as Administrative Secretary of Friends United meeting, and Meredith or Marty Walton was the General Secretary of Friends General Conference. A lot of the meetings in Friends United meeting are more programmed. They have services that look, even more like regular Protestant church services than this one does. And Friends General Conference tends to be the unprogrammed friends who still worship in the traditional way. Since I was working at a job that was less than satisfactory, that I would eventually have to physically force myself to get up and go to every morning, which you don't want to be in that position ever if you can avoid it. Anyway, I took a whole week of vacation and went to Guilford. Now, in one of the sessions, Marty Walton told us the story. It seems she'd been very busy with a lot of things. I believe she was in the middle of a move or something. And she was getting more and more tired and frustrated. So she almost blurts out a prayer to God, "Help me." And she gets an answer almost immediately. "Go take a bath." And she said her mind went almost immediately to all the things that she had to do. Then her inner child sort of took over and kind of whined, "But I don't want to. I don't have time." And then, like any good 5-year-old, she decides to try to get what she wants out of the other parent, which in this case means that she asked the maternal side of God, since God the Father had been less than satisfactory, at least to her mind. And at once she said she had this image of a bathtub full of warm, relaxing, inviting water, so she took a bath. And she was convinced, at least in retrospect, that she was able to go on with her day with much less stress and much more successfully and productively than she would have if she hadn't listened. Well, I was listening, and I was also at a sort of low period in my own life, so I decided to ask God for help myself. The first response I got was to be patient because things were about to change. So then I ran like any good 5-year-old to God the Mother and said, "Help!" And the image I saw was a woman, not just any woman, a very pregnant woman who looked like she was about to go into labor. No more than 6 weeks later, I saw an ad in the local paper which said that the Kernersville Little Theater was holding auditions for a production of Fiddler on the Roof. And when I was at Guilford back in March, one of my old professors said that one of his friends on the faculty was about to direct a show, out my way in Kernersville. So I auditioned, and it was an experience that changed my life. That was when I really got to know Joyce. That was also when I met a great many new friends. I'm still close to some of these people, although a lot of them are gone now. After all, 1987 was was a fur piece back, as you might say. Joyce used to say it was like having 35 people all fall in love with each other at the same time. And that's how my prayer was answered. God provides. Now, does any of this mean that I've begun venerating the great mother goddess of my Celtic ancestors? Of course not. No more than Marty Walton presumably was back in 1987. Nor am I saying that any of the rest of us need to either. But what I am saying is that God is far beyond such human concepts as gender, or if you want to add it, race. God is neither male nor female, but the source and origin of both. According to the book of Genesis, when God created humankind, we were created in God's own image, male and female. When the ancient Israelites arose, they were surrounded by people with fertility religions. Baal, the thunder god, had a consort goddess known variously as Asherah, Astarte or Ashtaroth, and Ishtar in Mesopotamia. This caused the Hebrew prophets to emphasize the maleness of their God, who is represented in the Bible by the four letters YHWH. That was God's name, which eventually was considered too holy to pronounce. Even now, I know people, and they're not all Jewish, by the way, who won't spell out the word God when they write. Instead, they spell it capital G hyphen D. So if you ever see that, that's what that's referring to. And they do this so they don't break the commandment against taking God's name in vain or to show respect for those who have that belief. What happened, at least with the Israelites, was that they eventually felt the need to show a feminine side of God, or at least some sort of feminine companion for God, in order to make God less remote and more approachable. So along comes the prophet Hosea. This is about 750 years before the birth of Jesus. And he does a couple of things. One of them is to make Israel the consort of God. The problem with that, of course, is that Hosea also said that Israel was God's cheating wife, just like Hosea's own wife was a cheater. The other thing Hosea did was this. In chapter 11, verses 3 to 4, which talks about God's relationship with the northern kingdom of Israel, also called Ephraim, because that was the most powerful of the tribes there, God is described in very maternal terms. I was the one who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up in my arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of compassion, with the bands of love, and I became to them like those who lift an infant to their cheeks, and I bent down and fed them. As it turns out, you get a number of similar statements in the Hebrew Bible, which we Christians call the Old Testament. In Isaiah 66:13, we find God compared to a comforting mother. Like one whose mother comforts him, so I myself will comfort you. But that isn't all. In Deuteronomy 32:18, God gives birth to the people. Now this is expanded on in Isaiah 42:14, where God is explicitly likened to a woman in labor. For a long time I've held my peace. I've kept still and restrained myself. Now I will cry out like a woman in labor. I will gasp and pant. So God is giving birth. In this case, to the future. But this is an image that a lot of mystics, across the centuries, especially in Western Europe, in the Catholic Church or later, pick up on. Then there's perhaps the most startling passage of all, in Isaiah 49:13-16a, Israel is not God's consort. God is Israel's breastfeeding mother. This is an image that stunned me when I first came across it. In fact, it was enough to convince me of something I already suspected, that the author of this part of Isaiah was a woman. Yes, a man could have written it, but a woman would have gotten there first. Sing for joy, O heavens, and exult, O earth. Break forth, O mountains, into singing. For the Lord has comforted his people and will have compassion on his afflicted. But Zion said, the Lord has forsaken me. My husband, Adonai, in Hebrew, has forgotten me. Can a woman forget the baby at her breast or have no compassion for the child of her womb? Even these may forget, yet I will not forget you. I have engraved you on the palms of my hands. So God is not only like Israel's breastfeeding mother, God is even more tender than that. There are more examples like this, but you get the idea. In the New Testament, there's a similar situation, but only in a few places. In Matthew 23:37 and Luke 13:34, Jesus laments over Jerusalem. Luke says it's on the first Palm Sunday. And he uses the image of a broody mother hen gathering her chicks under her wings to refer to himself and his love for Jerusalem. If the reference in Luke sounds a bit familiar, it's because I mentioned it a few weeks ago as one of the 3 times Jesus is said in the Gospels to have shed tears. And in Luke 15:8-10, Jesus tells the story of a woman who loses one of her 10 silver coins and doesn't rest until she finds it. She turns the house upside down until she finds it. And when she does, she invites her neighbors to come celebrate with her. Jesus likens this woman to God when one of God's lost children comes back to the fold. Most of the time, however, Jesus falls back on the standard male imagery for God, which, unfortunately, is what the majority of the church has also done. I know that Jesus' favorite way of referring to God was as the Heavenly Father, which goes back to the time of King David. But if you stop to think about it, all these images, God is Heavenly Father, God is a comforting mother, God is a broody hen, a mother bird sheltering her young under her wings, or even God is a breastfeeding mother, are what you might call relational metaphors. They don't tell us what God is. They tell us what God is like in relationship with us. If you remember the message some time ago where I read you a children's book called Old Turtle, it's very much like that. To refresh your memory, Old Turtle is about all of the animals and even some elements of the natural world that we think of as inanimate, like the mountains and the wind, having an argument about what God is like. Everybody in the story thinks that God is like them, but the answer is that God is like every one of these things and more. And it turns out that the variability of God, including God's mother-like side, might help us to deal with some of the more difficult passages in the Bible. Many modern people find the passages in the Old Testament where the ancient Israelites make war on the Canaanites distasteful, especially when these wars are described as somehow being God's will. This is too big a topic to go into in any great detail here, but I will offer a couple of thoughts. One is that, like Judith has said on a number of occasions, it's helpful to think of the Bible in terms of themes. And one of the most important can be described as the question of just who is part of the people of God. At first, the answer is framed as the family of Abraham's descendants, which eventually grows into the whole Israelite nation. And during this time, God's will and the national interests of the Israelites look suspiciously like each other, which is what tends to happen. At least that's true for the Israelites. I have a friend that I've said that my big objection to the whole God and country thing that you sometimes see is that it usually tends to turn into country is God. But even during this period, prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and then the second, and after her, the third Isaiah, began the process of widening the definition of God's people. The entire book of Jonah is a midrash, or interpretive story, on this very question. After them, Jesus, then Peter, and then Paul all give what became the definitive Christian response. All people are God's people. Therefore, God's will doesn't necessarily correspond very closely with anybody's national interests, no matter what the perspective of any of the biblical authors before then might have been. My other thought is that God's love can be fiercely protective, like a mother's, even like a mama bear's. Let me digress for a moment, and I think it'll help you see what I mean. Joyce used to tell stories about how fiercely their mother had looked out for her and her brother after their father's sudden death, which happened when Joyce was 14. In one story, Joyce had had to spend over an hour standing around in the cold winter air, clad only in her sweaty gym suit, because the school got a bomb threat and they made everybody go outside immediately without stopping to get, without stopping to change, certainly, or even to get their coats. In another, a football player decided he was entitled to shove Joyce out of his way as he cut in the lunch line to join his buddies, and left a hand-shaped bruise on her. In yet another story, Joyce's brother nearly passed out from loss of blood after he cut his leg, and he made the mistake of walking into the ER waiting room rather than letting them put him in a wheelchair and wheel him in. In all of these situations, the result was the same. In Joyce's words, the battleship Mama came sailing full steam ahead with guns blazing to look out for Joyce and her brother. And this acknowledgement is really something because Joyce and her mother had a relationship which can best be described as difficult much of the time. The fierceness of a mother's love and protection is proverbial, especially when it comes to mama bears. One year when I was in elementary school, there was a poem called Grizzly Bear in our reading book, and I remember it all these years later. That was years ago, by the way. It was written by a woman named Mary Hunter Austin, and it went like this. If you ever meet a grizzly bear, you must never ask him where he is going or what he is doing. For if you ever dare to stop a grizzly bear, you'll never meet another grizzly bear. Well, that's nothing compared to a mama bear protecting her cub. We've all heard the stories. You never get between a mama bear and her cub. Not if you don't want to face serious, possibly fatal consequences. That is. And it just so happens that God is described using the metaphor of a mama bear in Hosea 13:8. But in that case, God is so angry with the northern kingdom that I will fall upon them like a bear robbed of her cubs. I will tear open their breast, and there I will devour them like a lion, as a wild beast would rend them. As it says in Hebrews 13:8, it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. So when it comes to the book of Joshua, for instance, and its narrative of a bloody Israelite conquest of Canaan, perhaps the most useful thing that we can take away from such texts is the idea that the writer was conscious of God's fiercely protective love. So why does any of this matter? One of my professors at Guilford used to say that sometimes we build theological sandcastles that look interesting but don't really do much of anything. But this isn't one of those times. It matters because we need to be able to see the reflection of God in each other. If we don't, then we tend to undervalue other people. And if we undervalue people, then we are much more likely to treat them badly and to oppress them. In college, I was a member of a student-led fellowship group, and we used to sing a song called Have You Seen Jesus, My Lord? One of the verses asks whether you've ever seen the face of Christ in your brother. Then I say, you've seen Jesus, my Lord. Some of the people I've known used to express the opinion that men and women each hold up half the sky. That is, both are vital to the structure of this world. Both should be respected. Both should be honored. So on this Mother's Day, I hope that we will take time to honor our mothers. And if for some reason we can't honor our actual mothers, let's not forget to honor the surrogate mothers, the metaphorical mothers in our lives. Amen.